What if one moment in 1958 could change everything you thought you knew about the Cold War? Picture Fidel Castro's rebels scrambling through the Sierra Maestra, barely surviving an ambush that could have ended the revolution before it really began. Imagine no bearded guerrillas marching into Havana on New Year's Day, no sudden overthrow of Batista, and no Castro-led government to challenge the United States. Now think about the stakes. No Soviet missiles just 90 miles from Florida. How close did we actually come to a world without the Cuban Missile Crisis? The answer starts with the razor-thin margins of Castro's early campaign and the movements when history could have turned on a single misstep. The fragile beginning, moments that could have stopped Castro. The earliest days of Castro's revolution were anything but assured. The movement's fragile beginning is often overshadowed by its later triumph, but the odds were stacked against it from the start. In December 1956, Castro and 81 others set out from Mexico aboard the Granma yacht, hoping to ignite an uprising against Fulgencio Batista. Almost immediately, disaster struck. The Granma ran late, landing them in the wrong spot and leaving them exposed. Batista's army, tipped off and waiting, ambushed the group in the remote swamps of eastern Cuba. Official records show only 20 of the 82 men survived the initial ambush, including Fidel, Raúl, and Che Guevara. The rest were either killed or captured before they could even reach the mountains. For most movements, that would have been the end. Those who escaped found themselves in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, battered and on the run. The environment was harsh, and the group was small, poorly supplied, and constantly hunted. Batista's forces, equipped with US-supplied arms and training, launched repeated offensives. The US had supported Batista's movement since his 1952 coup, providing weapons and financial backing right up until 1960. That meant Batista's soldiers outgunned the rebels at every turn. The revolutionaries relied on the dense forests and their own resourcefulness to survive. There were moments of real tension among the leadership, especially in early 1957, as the stress of near-total defeat threatened to fracture the group. Castro's authority wasn't absolute, and disagreements over tactics and ideology simmered beneath the surface. Despite these setbacks, the rebels managed to regroup and shift tactics. They moved from failed conventional attacks to a drawn-out guerrilla campaign, targeting outposts and infrastructure. Batista's regime responded with brutal crackdowns, but also with mistakes. The rebels' survival often depended on Batista's forces underestimating them or striking at the wrong time. Take the Battle of La Plata in 1958. Batista sent a large force to encircle the rebels, but poor coordination and local knowledge allowed Castro's men to slip away and inflict losses. These narrow victories were never guaranteed. A single well-executed offensive by Batista could have ended the uprising for good. Throughout this period, American support for Batista was a decisive factor. The regime's access to US arms and finance gave it a critical edge. It wasn't until Washington began losing patience for Batista's corruption and inability to restore order that the balance started to shift. As US aid dried up, Batista's grip weakened, giving the rebels some breathing room. Still, the revolution's survival was never inevitable. If Castro hadn't slipped away one night in the mountains, would we even remember his name now? It's easy to forget just how close Cuba came to a very different future. The revolution's fragility raises a question. What might have unfolded if those early setbacks had been fatal? The answer isn't just about Cuba itself, but about the world that watched from a distance. Because without Castro's victory, the island's destiny, and its relationship with the United States, would have taken a dramatically different path. Cuba as America's playground, a capitalist future. Step into Havana in the early 1960s, not as a revolutionary stronghold, but as a glossy outpost of American leisure and commerce. The city's waterfront hotels buzz with tourists, jazz pours out of neon-lit nightclubs, and the casinos run all night. This was Batista's Cuba, a magnet for American dollars, where the entertainment industry thrived and US investment shaped almost every corner of daily life. Batista's regime didn't just tolerate this relationship, it depended on it. Cuba earned its nickname, America's Playground, by catering to the whims of wealthy visitors from the United States. Historians estimate that Americans owned about 3/4 of the island's sugar plantations and utilities. US companies ran power grids, railways, and much of the banking sector. The mafia, meanwhile, made Havana its own, running casinos and nightclubs with the government's blessing. The money flowed freely, but it mostly pooled at the top. If you looked past the bright lights and the crowds at the Tropicana, you'd see a different Cuba. For the rural poor and many city dwellers, the prosperity never reached them. Entire villages went without basic services like electricity or running water, and jobs on the sugar plantations paid just enough to keep families above starvation. The divide was sharp. Batista and his allies accumulated fortunes while corruption seeped through every level of government. Bribes were routine. Whether you were a police chief or a city official, everyone seemed to have a price. The benefits of Cuba's close relationship with the US rarely made their way into the lives of ordinary people. But in this alternate timeline, with no successful revolution, this system would have stayed in place. US tourism and investment would likely have grown even further, making Cuba an even more important hub for American influence in the Caribbean. The US government, eager to keep a friendly regime in power, might have invested more in infrastructure, hoping to modernize the island and protect its own interests. The casinos would keep expanding, the beaches would stay crowded, and the flow of dollars would keep the economy humming, at least for those at the top. Yet the pressure under the surface would have kept building. The roots of the 1959 revolution weren't just about ideology, they were about daily life. Discontentment among workers and the rural poor was real, and it showed up in protests, strikes, and underground movements throughout the 1950s. Even if Castro's movement had failed, those same conditions, inequality, corruption, and the sense that Cuba's future was being decided in Washington or Miami instead of Havana would not have disappeared. Another movement, maybe less ideological but just as determined, could have risen up in response. The relationship with the United States would have defined this version of Cuba. During the Cold War, Washington would have counted on its Caribbean ally as a buffer against communist influences in the region. The US might have viewed Cuba as a model of capitalist success, but the reality on the ground would have remained complicated. By prioritizing economic control and ignoring social unrest, the US might have set the stage for new crises. Every year that the divide between rich and poor widened, the risk of rebellion would have grown. So, with a capitalist Cuba firmly in America's orbit, the island's fate would have been tied to US interests in a way that shaped not just its own future, but the broader dynamics of the Cold War. The question isn't just what Cuba would look like without Castro, it's how the entire global balance of power might have shifted without a communist foothold so close to American shores. No Cuban Missile Crisis, a Cold War without Castro. No Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the reality in a world where Castro never takes power. The event that brought the world the closest it's ever come to nuclear war, the standoff in October 1962 with US spy planes discovering Soviet nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida, simply doesn't happen. Every part of that crisis, from Kennedy's televised address to the tense naval quarantine to those secret letters between Washington and Moscow, was set in motion by Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union and the fear that the US would try to topple his regime. It all started with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The CIA trained Cuban exiles, hoping they'd spark an anti-Castro uprising. Instead, Castro's forces crushed the operation in 3 days, and the debacle embarrassed the Kennedy administration on the world stage. For Khrushchev, this wasn't just a failed coup. It was proof that the US might try again, maybe even invade outright. That's why, in the aftermath, the Soviets decided to secretly install nuclear missiles in Cuba, to deter another attack and protect their new ally. Khrushchev's move was a direct response to US hostility and the embargo, not just a bid for bargaining power. But if Castro's revolution had failed, if Batista or another pro-US leader stayed in charge, none of this would unfold. There's no communist government in Havana, no Bay of Pigs, and no urgent Soviet need to plant missiles on the island. Cuba would remain a US partner, and the Soviets would lose their best shot at placing nuclear weapons within striking distance of American cities. So what do the Soviets do instead? Without Cuba as a base, they'd likely look for other ways to challenge US influence in the Americas. The most plausible move, according to historians, would be to ramp up support for leftist movements in places like Nicaragua or Venezuela. Moscow might funnel more resources, advisors, and weapons to insurgencies there, hoping to carve out a new foothold in the Western Hemisphere. That could mean more proxy wars and covert operations, just not in Cuba. Meanwhile, the US would still be laser-focused on containment, but the immediate threat would shift. With no missiles in the Caribbean, Washington might double down on supporting anti-communist regimes elsewhere in Latin America, or even turn its attention to other global hotspots. The Monroe Doctrine would still be in play, but without the same urgency to intervene militarily right on America's doorstep. Here's the twist. The absence of the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't necessarily make the Cold War safer. That confrontation forced both superpowers to stare down the real possibility of nuclear destruction. It led to the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline and opened the door to arms control talks, measures that helped keep later crises from spiraling out of control. Without that terrifying lesson, the US and USSR might have blundered into even riskier standoffs elsewhere, with fewer safeguards and less willingness to compromise. And Castro himself? Without him, Cuba never becomes the symbol of defiance that it did in our timeline, and Latin America's place in the Cold War story changes. The Soviets would have to find new ways to challenge the US, and the region might have seen different kinds of turmoil. Without that Cuban flashpoint, would the Cold War have burned hotter or cooled off? That missing confrontation might have been the very thing that kept superpowers from tipping into total war. Conclusion. The story of the Cuban Revolution shows just how much history can turn on a handful of fragile moments. One lucky escape, one missed bullet, and the world's balance of power shifts. Fidel Castro's survival didn't just change Cuba, it redirected the entire Cold War, making a small island the center of global tension for decades. If you're fascinated by these narrow escapes, let us know in the comments which historical close call you find most surprising. We'll pin a timeline graphic in the comments or description so you can see how these moments stack up. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe to Alt History Zone for more exciting updates on what could have been. Stay tuned!